always from the heart of the city, and now on demand 24/7 on the CHFI website. This is the soundtrack to The Dark Side of the Moon. And it really has nothing to do with Pink Floyd. And I'm Don Jackson, around the world on the internet. It was Shakespeare who wrote, "The mortal moon hath her eclipse endured." Of course, we know so much more today, but some people still get a little edgy when an eclipse occurs. We have a very rare occurrence today, the longest solar eclipse of the entire century. But it still won't be really visible here in the Northern Hemisphere. I still thought we might spend a little time in the shadow of the moon. With Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Nelly Furtado with All Good Things and Dogs Barking at the New Moon, and Celine Dion, Have You Ever Been in Love? Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. I'm consumed by the moon this week, and for very good reason. The longest solar eclipse of the century occurs today. A 6.7-minute totality that sweeps over India during its monsoon season, before traversing China and entering the Pacific at Shanghai. That according to the '09 edition of the Old Farmer's Almanac. Eclipse watchers would have to travel clear across the globe for the very best place to observe this rare phenomena. I understand that it will be available on YouTube for those who can't make the trip. We're still somewhat unnerved by eclipses, although not to the extent that our ancestors were. Martha White, in the 1994 edition of the Old Farmer's Almanac, wrote an article about the moon that I featured some excerpts from recently. She wrote, and I quote, "To many sky watchers, the moon is home to the gods." Plutarch, a first-century Greek essayist, considered it a way station for the coming and going of souls. Lunar eclipses, some believed, were instances of the moon being eaten up. Various rituals were enacted to bring the moon back, whether from eclipse or its monthly new moon phase disappearance. Shooting the moon, now an expression of great ambition, was an attempt to rekindle the light of the moon with fiery arrows. Unquote. Martha White, in the 1994 edition of the Old Farmer's Almanac. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Neil Young, Under a Harvest Moon, and Rod Stewart's Broken Arrows. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. I'm Don Jackson. In a segment writer Martha White describes as dreams and superstitions in this article in the Old Farmer's Almanac, she wrote, and again I quote, "Dreams of an eclipsed moon are said to predict a contagious disease close at hand." Unquote. Fortunately, we have come a long way in our thinking since people believed in that superstition. And this from a very old encyclopedia. When the moon, in its journey around the Earth, passes directly between the Earth and the Sun, it casts its shadow on the surface of the Earth, and an eclipse of the Sun takes place. In ancient times, this explanation of an eclipse was not known, and people in all parts of the world feared the strange darkness. For thousands of years, the people of India believed that it was caused by a huge dragon with black jaws, which was trying to eat up the sun. In the belief that they would frighten the monster away, arrows were shot into the air and gongs were beaten. People in Greece said that Jupiter had hung something over the sun so that the other gods on Mount Olympus could not see what he was doing on Earth. Even in Europe, 400 years ago, men hid in cellars during an eclipse, and women screamed and fainted. In our time, most people have no fear of an eclipse. On the contrary, they look forward to a total eclipse with interest and pleasure. Instead of hiding in caves or cellars, they travel, if they can, to some part of the country where they can see it well. Although the time during which a solar eclipse is total is never more than about 7.5 minutes, astronomers travel long distances in order to make special observations. Expeditions have been sent to strange and out-of-the-way places, such as a coral island in the mid-Pacific, the deserts of Africa, and the coasts of Siberia and Labrador. Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and CHFI.com. Lionel Richie and You Are. Jann Arden with Jackson Browne, Unloved, and Carly Simon. And someone in a Learjet who went to Nova Scotia to see the total eclipse of the sun. And You're So Vain. Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and CHFI.com. Oh, dark, dark, dark amid the blaze of noon, irrecoverably dark. Total eclipse, without all hope of day. Milton, describing a solar eclipse at midday. Christopher Columbus was smart enough to surmise that the Earth was round because of his observations of an eclipse. In a letter to the sovereigns on the third voyage, October 18, 1498, he wrote, I have always read that the world, both land and water, was spherical, as the authority and researches of Ptolemy and all the others who have written on this subject demonstrate and prove, as do the eclipses of the moon and other experiments that are made from east to west, and the elevation of the North Star from north to south. He may not have been the first to discover the New World. He may, of course, been beaten by the Vikings and other peoples. But he certainly knew in his heart that our world was round. But earlier peoples didn't know what to make of an eclipse, or feared the worst. Shakespeare seems a trifle cynical looking at the colors in the sky. Roses have thorns, and silver fountains mud. Clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun, and loathsome canker lives in the sweetest bud. All men make faults. Fortunately, we've learned that an eclipse in this instance means nothing more than the Earth passing between the moon and the sun, not a harbinger of disasters to come. And if something were to take place, it would be a simple matter of coincidence. But our view of the moon has always been one through the eyes of superstition. And then there are those who don't believe in coincidence, even today. Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and CHFI.com. Faith Hill with This Kiss, and Eric Clapton and Change the World. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and CHFI.com. This is an anecdote from Bartlett's Book of Anecdotes. During the Peloponnesian War, an eclipse occurred when Pericles was about to set out to sea. As the pilot was too terrified to perform his duties, Pericles stepped forward and covered the man's head with his cloak. "Does this frighten you?" he asked. "No," said the pilot. "Then what difference is there between the two events?" inquired Pericles. "Except that the sun is covered by a larger object than my cloak." Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Creedence, Clearwater Revival, and A Bad Moon Rising, Colbie, Caillat, Bubbly, and Benny King, and Stand By Me. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. As a writer in Bloom's Farmers and Planters Almanac for 2005 wrote, and I quote, "If you plan to watch any solar eclipse, be sure to have protective eyewear. Special glasses can be purchased locally or over the internet. Darkly smoked glass can also be used. Peeking at the eclipse for more than a second or two could result in eye damage." In case you wondered, the sun is really not eaten by voracious dragons as some ancients thought, nor has it abandoned the earth as the Greeks feared. The word eclipse comes from the Greek word meaning abandonment. In some parts of the world, people banged pots together, shot arrows into the sky, chanted, and confessed sins when an eclipse occurred. They were all successful. The sun returned to the earth. Unquote. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.